Angela Burnett was born and raised in the Virgin Islands, and her passion for the smart development of the territory led her to pursue a career in environmental management. In 2007, she graduated from Brandeis University with a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and sustainable development. She also holds a master's from Rutgers in regional and city planning. The primary goal as environmental manager and planner is to promote sustainable and progressive communities that are resilient to climate change. In the Virgin Islands, she served the government as the territory's climate change officer since 2008. In that role, she designed and implemented public education programming, conducted vulnerability and capacity assessment of the tourism sector, authored the territory's first climate change policy, managed local adaptation projects, and helped lead the development of the Virgin Islands Climate Change Trust Fund. Having recently lived through the devastation of Hurricane Irma, the most powerful Atlantic hurricane ever at landfall, she feels compelled to bring her expertise and passion to a broader audience globally. Angela, on behalf of my fellow colleagues here of Environmental Climate Justice, we are very excited to have you join a list of experts in the climate change arena as part of our interview process.
Thank you so much, Robert and team, for having me and giving me the opportunity to share this message with you.
So with that introduction, I think one of the things that we're particularly excited about in talking to you is your unique perspective. Most of our other experts are US-based people who are academics, scientists. Bill McKibben is an example. Folks at University Concerned Scientists, Sierra Club, etc. I don't think we've talked to anyone who's literally been on the front lines, not only knows the field, but has experienced it firsthand, all these predicted devastating consequences of climate change. So with that's how we'd love to have you share with us, if you could go back to that moment, or that 36, 48, 72, however many hours that you experienced this hurricane. What were your feelings? What were your thoughts? What were your reactions?
Right. Well, thank you. That is indeed an important question to try to sort of jump into the frontline experience. And I have to tell you, I have been working in this field for about 10 years now, and a lot of what I've done is education. I would speak to everyone from primary school students to our ministers in cabinet and warn about the various impacts of climate change, including stronger hurricanes at category 5 level, etc. And I have to tell you that living the experience shocked even me. Even after warning about what it could be like for about 10 years, I didn't even fully appreciate myself how terrifying and how absolutely destructive such an event would be. Because as you said in your introduction, this was really an unprecedented event. I remember actually being in the hurricane, literally holding on to our doors, holding on to our windows, praying that our roof would not fly off and we would lose everything or potentially get hurt or killed. And somehow in those moments, I actually thought about my heroes. I thought about my climate change heroes, those persons that I had met throughout my 10 years in the field, who had been fighting for climate change, fighting for climate change for the last 30 years. And I really thought of those people and felt so grateful for the work that they do, and recognize the importance even more personally of this issue, and really coming together to fight this issue. It felt more real than it had ever felt before. And not just for myself, I think for everyone on this island, people really have now a first-hand appreciation of what we mean when we say the impacts of climate change. When we talk about stronger, unprecedented events, it's no longer theoretical. It's very real. There are lives, many lives that have been entirely transformed by this event. I would easily say that we've set ourselves back. We've been set back, I should say, maybe a good 50 years in terms of the course of our development by this singular event.
So I guess along those lines, as you were experiencing this, can you talk a little bit about what it was like in your home? I've listened to you and I've read some of the book. So I know that you were with your mother and some of your siblings and so forth. What was the shared impact for you and as you thought about and with your family members and close neighbors and such? Can you talk a little bit about that experience in that time frame?
Sure. Well, I have to say that my personal immediate family were among the fortunate. I mean, we definitely experienced impacts, but nowhere on the scale of other close family members and neighbors and friends. So just to give you a sense of the contrast, at our home, we eventually, as we thought we had lost the roof, but as it turns out, we didn't. It was the impact of our neighbor's roof landing on ours that created some confusion. So in the end, we were able to just get away with a gallery that was entirely blown off, disappeared. Our work shed was entirely destroyed. But apart from that, the main structure was relatively fine. But like I said, our neighbor's house roof entirely blown off. In fact, every single one of our neighbors, and there are about perhaps 10 or so homes on the hillside where we live, I think that our house roof was the only one that remained. Every single house roof on that hillside was gone. The morning after the hurricane, we got out like everybody else on the island and just started walking to make sure that friends and relatives were okay. I remember our fear that my younger brother, who lives at my grandmother's home, which is about a 10-minute drive away. I remember our fear during the storm and after the storm that that home might not have made it, might not have survived, and wanting to go and check on him, but not being able to leave. The hurricane went well into the wee hours of the morning, so that that you cannot go out into the storm and check, that you have no way to actually see if they're okay, and just sort of the terror of the unknown, not knowing how your family members have fared. There's no way to communicate because there are no phones, there's no phone service, there's no internet service. So we literally walked, and what is ordinarily, an easy drive became sort of an incredible walk to get there because the roads were entirely blocked and so forth. And my mother, who's now quite, in her older years, she refused to stay at home and wait to hear the news of what might have happened to her son. She was determined to come on that walk and find out firsthand if he was okay or not. Thankfully, they were fine, and we journeyed on to see about other family members, and they were not as fortunate as we were. Persons had lost their entire house roofs, meaning that they could literally see the sky, and it only took a few minutes into our walk without anybody really having to tell us before we realized that people must have died. There's no way that we can look around and see this level of devastation and everybody be okay. And that turned out to be the reality. People had lost their lives. A number of people had gotten seriously injured. So many people have lost everything, literally everything. I mean, the percentage is about 14 to 15% of homes entirely demolished, flattened. A good third of homes, about 30% of homes, severe damage. So that's something like losing an entire house roof. And about 2/3 of the building stock was impacted in some way. So I mean, even today, almost a year on, the ramifications of Hurricane Irma are still very, very real. There's a community close to the Road Town area, capital city, that I've had to drive through pretty often in the last few days. And every time I go through them, I'm still pretty gutted by the experience, because I drive for a good 10 minutes and in every direction that I look, a house roof is missing. And I'm just thinking to myself, where did these people even run to? How did they survive? And where are people living now? And I had a conversation with somebody else in my age group the other day, and I raised that question, where are people even living? And she told me of one instance where a classmate of ours, her entire family has now moved into the apartment of somebody else, which was a 1-bedroom apartment, which is now apparently housing about 8 persons. And I think this is so many people's story. Persons just having to come together and find a way to just keep going, you know, so many months after the storm.
So thank you. And one of the things I saw in a reference in your book that one of your interviewees or writers coined the phrase, it really looked like a war zone and called it Armageddon.
Yes.
That's a pretty powerful image. Can you say a little bit about, you know, those kind of basic services that, you know, people expect around water and sewage and power and so on, and what have been the obviously here in the States we've heard a lot more about Puerto Rico than we have BVI. Could you say a little bit about what the impact has been?
Sure, definitely. I mean, that imagery that you described was certainly real. It's not an exaggeration at all. I mean, I've been through every category of hurricane before, or right up to a category 4, and I've never seen devastation like that in my life. You walk outside and 2 things immediately came to mind. A bomb has gone off and a wildfire has rolled through this country. The hillsides were entirely bare. They were stripped of all vegetation. There was debris everywhere. I mean, when I say debris, crumbled homes, vehicles tossed and turned. In fact, in some cases, vehicles had apparently been thrown several hundred meters and were down hillsides far away from where people even live. And it's almost unimaginable as to how some of the debris ended up in the places that it did. In the marine environment, you know, hundreds of yachts were flipped over, sunken. So there was just debris in everywhere that you turn, there was debris. The roads were entirely blocked. But getting to some of those critical services you mentioned, I personally walked for about 6 hours perhaps the morning after Irma, just making sure that family and friends were okay. And there was not an electricity pole that I passed that was still standing. Every single pole had fallen, and you know, the electrical lines were crisscrossing the street. And I remember thinking to myself, 6 months. It's going to be 6 months before we get electricity again. And it turns out I was pretty spot on. It took 6 months before electricity was restored to the entire population. In fact, the country was in complete blackout for about 5 days post Irma. And when I say that, I mean that literally not even the main electricity generation plant had power. That plant itself was impacted, such that the Black Start unit, which is used to restart a plant if there was some kind of catastrophic failure, even that device was damaged, and it took the Army Corps of Engineers that came in from the UK to help resolve that issue. So it was a good 2 months before any communities had electricity. And this had spin-off effects because, for instance, our portable water supply, 100% of that is provided through desalination, which of course is dependent on electricity. So without power, there was limited production of potable water. And it's really thanks to the fact that we're historically a very dry climate. So by law, all residences in the Virgin Islands must have a cistern, basically a catchment within the home where we store rainwater. And it is only as a result of that feature that we were able to avert a major public health crisis, because people had their independent source of clean water that they could use for drinking and run in the home. It took a good 2 weeks before the main road system could be cleared, because every road was literally impassable. I mean, the book, if you go through some of those stories.
Yeah, I just saying it. I think that gives us a feel for the vast, extensive impact and how it affected people's lives for a long, long time. And what I'm wondering, another level, could you speak to the psychological and sociological impact on people, the community, and both short-term and long-term? How did people feel and respond?
Right. Yes. Well, you know, that's an interesting question. I think when you face that level of catastrophic impact, there is certainly some psychological implications. I think in the immediate aftermath, people find themselves in a position where you're literally in survival mode. you're trying to just make sure you have the essentials of logical impacts don't start to really surface and manifest until maybe some months on, when people are, you know, sort of trying to transition back to some sort of normalcy. But I think that was manifested in a number of ways. So I talked about the fact that the storm resulted in some immediate deaths. But what I think is particularly interesting is the fact that uh, in the 2 months that followed the hurricane, our death rate literally doubled. Every day you would have somebody else who had died. And it wasn't as a result of any direct injury from the hurricane. I would really put it down to just the stress level that existed post hurricane and in that sort of disaster context, as well as the impact that had occurred to our health services. So it meant that people couldn't get the regular access to healthcare that they are accustomed to having. So I think the death rate really speaks to the trauma that people experienced, that doubling in the 2 months after the hurricane. If I'm thinking about the younger persons in the community, the youth, I'm thinking specifically of a story that was captured in the Irma Diaries, and one parent talking about the fact that their child was so traumatized from the event that they didn't speak for weeks. They literally did not speak for weeks. And, you know, a child that you could hardly get to sit down and read a book before just curled up in books for weeks and weeks and weeks, you know, just finding some way to try to process what had happened. And there are many stories in the book of very young children, you know, ages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, who even in the storm itself couldn't face the storm, you know, would do things like block their ears or cover their faces, just couldn't face the terror of the storm. I know that a number of people have expressed to me, you know, certainly the fear of going into this hurricane season and not knowing if something like Irma would happen again. And I think a lot of people have determined in their mind that they can perhaps do this once. They can try to pick up the pieces of their life and, you know, recover from this event. But if something like this were to happen again, many people have said, I cannot do this again. I cannot stay here. And so you see the real potential of people picking up their lives and probably having to migrate and, you know, think about going somewhere else that might not face these type of extreme climatic events. And several people have already left. You know, the other very interesting dynamic is that in addition to totally, I think, transforming lives, was, like I said, a lot of people have literally lost everything, and some people were not insured, so there's not sort of a ready mechanism by which they can recover their lives. You know, a lot of families have become separated as a result of Hurricane Irma, because one of the serious impacts in terms of social services was to the school system. So even now, students are still attending very makeshift schools, some in tents and that sort of thing. The main public high school in particular was severely impacted. In fact, parts of that campus literally crumbled, was entirely demolished. And so a lot of parents within weeks of the hurricane had to send their children abroad, whether to the US or other Caribbean islands, to just be able to continue their education. And that effect still lingers. So there are a number of families that are still separated as a result of Hurricane Irma. I think another good indicator of sort of the psychological impact of the hurricane is the fact that after Irma, which was on the 6th of September, nobody took down their boarding, their hurricane shuttering, which by tradition is something people would do immediately following the storm, because if you're boarded up, it means that you have limited light and you have limited air. And for the first time in my entire life, nobody took their boards down following Irma, because I think people were just so terrified by the fact that this had happened. We were still in hurricane season. And so I know certainly in our household, we made a very conscious decisions that we are not taking on the boards until the end of hurricane season, and perhaps a few weeks after, just for safety. And every household apparently made that decision. And it's a good thing, you know, that fear was not sort of hysteria, and it wasn't sort of overreactive, because as it turned out, 2 days after Hurricane Irma, we were threatened by a Category 4 Hurricane Jose. And sure enough, 2 weeks following Irma, we were hit again by another Category 5 Hurricane Maria. And so I think that action of not taking down the boards was sort of a good indicator of the level of terror that
So,
continued to reign
so
throughout the
Angela,
reign of the hurricane season.
oh my goodness, clearly very profound impacts. And one of the things that that leads to is wondering, clearly the Virgin Islands are a small island and, not a lot of industry. So contributing a very small amount of carbon to the greenhouse problem that's causing all this climate change to accelerate so fast and causing these hurricanes to come at a level and intensity that never happened before. In the meantime, those of us up here in the States and Europe, and I guess China's joining us now, are generating lots of carbon and responsible for the lion's share of climate change problems. I guess another emotion I'm wondering about, and it could be you yourself, but I'm wondering about your family or your compatriots there in the British Virgin Islands. Are there any people who feel that this is grossly unfair and that they're angry about people in the world who are actually contributing to the primary impetus to the problem?
Yeah, no, that's a very that's a very insightful question, and the answer is definitely yes. I can speak for myself. Like I said, I remember even during the terror and the horror of the event itself, I remember thinking about the climate change issue and having a mixture of emotions. I talked about really reflected on those heroes of mine who have been fighting for this issue for such a long time, but there was certainly a feeling of anger. I think in particular after the event, and you came out and you see your entire country devastated, you know that people have died, you know that it's not just torn down buildings, it's torn down lives. It's all of those impacts that I just talked about. And I think for me, what's particularly frustrating is that we know what the problem is, we understand it, we even know what the solutions are, and we have the capacity to implement the solutions, but there's just not that willingness, it seems, at the scale necessary to implement the solutions. And for it took me some time to process it, and I really thought long and hard about why. How is it that entire countries, and it's not just the Virgin Islands, entire countries around the world could be on the front lines, about to lose potentially a future in their homelands. And it seems as if there are people that just don't care, have entirely either turned a blind eye to the issue or don't even acknowledge that it exists, even though the science is so clear. And after thinking about it for a long time, I came to the conclusion that it really comes down to a disconnect. I don't think it's that we have necessarily bad people in the world. I think that we have a bad disconnect. That maybe the communication that has dominated in relation to climate change has made it feel as an issue that is sort of vague and fuzzy, distant, detached, down the road. It's polar bears and melting ice caps, not happening now, not affecting me, maybe not hurting anybody. And I certainly remembered a very personal experience, which was me walking out of my very first class on climate change as an undergraduate, as an environmental studies major, as somebody concerned about the environment, and really thinking that climate change wasn't that bad and it didn't have that much to do with me, and not really feeling compelled to act. And I thought, well, if I could feel that way as somebody, who's generally concerned about these type of issues, then how easy is it for the average person to feel that way? And for me, I then try to challenge that frustration, that anger into maybe trying to understand better this disconnect and thinking about how we could bridge the disconnect. Because I feel like if we get people to understand that this is an urgent, present issue happening now, hurting real people, and potentially making millions of people refugees, if we get people to understand that connection, then we get people to care, and then we get people to act. And I've had the privilege of having this conversation now with not just my colleagues who work on this issue, who express that similar level of anger and frustration, but having the opportunity to speak to people who literally had sort of, you know, near-death experiences during Hurricane Irma. And a number of them have, on their own, made the connection between these stronger hurricane events and climate change, and have spoken about the need for the world to really come together and act to save our futures, literally.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as a follow-up to that, I mean, it seems so sad, the reality of what you're saying, that there's not enough empathy and compassion in the rest of the world for countries like yours and the others that will be facing the Bangladesh's and the Polynesian islands and the rest that will get hit first. And one of the things we read about here sometimes, you've probably seen it, you know, in the States, when people are asked, you know, to contribute to different causes and such, is there's this ability to sort of put it at arm's length, and you sort of overload. You know, people don't like to look at poor starving babies and such. So
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, and I think I know this is one of the reasons that you wrote the book. You know, that you wrote the Irma Diaries, and that's part of your mission is to try to help make this, people see it more personally. But what do you? I mean, do you feel any success in? I know you were on a book tour in the States, but trying to generate enough compassion and enough feeling to get us, you know, to get Americans and others to change their lifestyles, to reduce the carbon footprints, you know, because as you said, it's urgent. It's not something that we can do gradually over like the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, what do you feel about the challenge and the levers, I guess, to, you know, try to bring it about?
Right. Yeah. No. Very good question, and very important question, because that's really the crux of it, right? For me, I think if we are successful in making climate change tangible, in making it something that people can sort of visualize and see and feel as present and urgent, then half the battle is won. I mean, if I think about the challenge that we had with the ozone hole, right, and how much that there's the success story, right, of the world coming together and, okay, understanding the problem, understanding what's contributing to it, and coming up with solutions, and coming together as a global community to ensure that those solutions were implemented, right? I see that as a real success in terms of solving a major global environmental issue. And to me, what really allowed that success to happen so quickly and so easily was the fact that people could see it. People could literally look at images and see that there's a hole in the ozone layer. People understood the health implications of that, and so the world was willing to come together and act, right? And we could identify the solutions, and they could be implemented. I feel like we have the same pieces of the puzzle in relation to climate change, but what is missing is that visualization. People are not able to clearly visualize and see the problem. You know, this is the climate change issue, and here are the consequences. And I feel like stories from the front lines is a very effective way to communicate that to people, for people to understand what it really means when we talk about climate change. And you mentioned the book tour in the USA, and I'm very pleased to say that along that tour, I did see these stories having the kind of impact that I hope that they would have. You know, I see people reacting to the stories, people who may not have really been concerned with the issue before, asking questions, you know, asking about the connections between climate change and stronger hurricanes, and those scientific links are very much there. In fact, I'll share what was for me a very rewarding experience coming out of the book tour. One of the universities that I had visited, Brandeis University, where I attended undergraduate school, within a few days of me leaving there and giving the presentation, I got an email from one of the professors who helped to organize that visit, telling me that about 70 students following the presentation had come together and protested the trustees at the university for them to divest, for them to take whatever pension fund investments, etc., that they had, and pull it away from companies that were invested in anything related to fossil fuels. And I thought back to the presentation that I had given and the questions that had been asked. And one student had asked, well, what can they do as students? What action can they take? And I remembered giving a response along those lines. And I thought, wow, these students were so impacted by these stories and so activated that they actually got themselves together and did something about it. And I thought that was very powerful and inspiring. And part of the message that I tried to communicate along the way is that, that the power of one is real as it relates to this challenge. I think a lot of people get discouraged from acting because they feel like, well, so what if I do things differently? It's not going to make a difference. And so part of what I communicated along the way is that if everybody took, in the US if everybody took this challenge of climate change mitigation personally and did simple actions that actually don't cost anything, they might actually save you money and don't require major lifestyle changes. If people took these simple actions, then collectively, the US could cut its emissions by about 20%, just by people making very minor adjustments. Things like turning off the lights, idling your car less, taking public transportation, maybe on a few of your trips as opposed to driving your personal vehicle, very small actions. And so I hope that, again, if we can get people to connect very personally, very tangibly with the issue, as we did with the ozone crisis, if we get people to appreciate that there are solutions and they don't take, giving up our lifestyles or giving up economic progress to achieve them, then I think people will be motivated to act. Because I believe generally in the goodness of people, and people not wanting to cause harm or cause suffer to other persons. And so I think what we really face is a communication hurdle, bridging a disconnect that has existed for a very long time.
Thank you, Angela. I mean, I just find myself listening to you extremely moved and impressed by both your brain power, but your passion and your heart as well. And I'm going to ask one more question and then maybe surprise my colleagues to sort of see if we have time for them to also say something. But I guess particularly, this will be my last question, and see if maybe you could give us a short answer and then see if my colleagues might want to add something. But okay, so here we are, 5 older white men in the United States, right? And we're part of the problem, our country and our economy and lifestyle. And yet, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't care deeply about the issue and want to have as much impact as we can with our audiences, which are other men and starting and their families and our communities. So can you give us, any specific guidance or advice on, looking at the 5 of us, what you'd encourage us to do?
Right. Well, thank you for that. So again, it goes back to those just very simple lifestyle modifications. I didn't realize, just me now as a person, how much excess unnecessary energy I use until I did without electricity for 6 months. And when the lights came back on, I realized, wow, I probably don't need to have that light on all the time, or I probably don't need to leave the TV running, or I don't need as much hot water as I thought I did. So there's just in our everyday lifestyles, if we paid attention to it, we would recognize so many uses of electricity that we sort of, I think unconsciously have every day that we could cut back on. And together that alone could have a major impact. So you're not doing anything except sort of turning things off that don't need to be on.
Let me ask you this, though. I'm sorry to interrupt, what I'm particularly saying in our mission, which is to try to communicate and persuade more men like us and younger men and their spouses and so forth. Any guidance you give us on how we communicate with them?
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood your question. Right. Well, what I've been encouraging persons to do is to maybe follow the model that I've tried to create, which is taking stories about climate change, to communicate climate change in a way that's more personal to people. So, you know, the Irma Diaries capture stories from the Virgin Islands and a particular expression of climate change, which is stronger hurricanes. But that's not the only story, right? There's stories from the New England area. It might be signs of sea level rising. It may be the series of unprecedented nor'easters that you had last winter, right? It might be changes in your snowfall. There are impacts happening right now in every single community. And part of what I've been encouraging is for people to document the changes that they see in their own backyard and share your own stories, right? Because the most effective stories are the stories that people can directly relate to, you know, the stories that they can share with their neighbor and they say, oh, you know, that's true. I have noticed that, but I've never really thought about it that way. I've never really paid so much attention to that, but you're right, that's true. That change has happened. So I would encourage you to maybe utilize that pathway, which I've tried to do through the Irma Diaries, and that is actually backed up by some very strong research. So intuitively, I thought it would be a good idea to share these stories, and since doing so, I've gone and looked at the literature and have found really impressive work out of places like Yale and their Communications Center on Climate Change that really advocate for this approach of storytelling and personal human experiences as the most effective way to communicate climate change and activate people on this issue. So certainly I would encourage you as a group to try to pull stories out of communities in your own backyard and have people share those stories.
Thank you. No, I think we'll take a good shot at doing that. So that's great advice. We're pretty close to the time that we need to close up here, but I did want to check to see if there's any one of my colleagues who has a particular issue that they might want to raise. I see two of them. So Steve, why don't you join in and ask your question?
Hi, I'm Steve Simmer from Northampton, Mass. I just have a comment and then something I was curious about while you were talking. The comment was that a lot of people that we talk to about climate change, when they start recognizing that maybe there is something happening with climate change, they say, well, what's so wrong with 3 or 4 degrees temperature? And the stories that you've been sharing with us talk about just real human suffering that's happening due to this. So it's not just a matter of raising the temperature 3 degrees, which is kind of an abstract issue, but you're talking about roofs blowing off houses and people doing without electricity for long periods of time. So that's my comment. My question was, in the US, we're kind of familiar with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which kind of oversees logistically and financially the recovery from disasters. And I was curious whether there is an agency like that, a funding source that's helping people with the recovery in BVI.
Right. Well, thank you for the comment and question. If I can just build on your comment, first of all, I'm really happy that you brought that out, because I think it is very easy for people to think, okay, like you said, 1 to 3-4 degrees sea rise, so what? That's just a few degrees. And I think what people need to appreciate, and this is part of communicating it, right, is that that's global average. And when you think about the global average, 1 to 4 degrees is huge. Part of how I try to explain to my students is, if you think about the difference between, an ice cube and melted ice, it's 1 degree, so 1 degree can mean a huge deal, right? If I think about stronger hurricanes, the hurricanes of last summer were generated by sea surface temperatures that were just a few degrees, above normal. And some very interesting work has come out of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which really speaks to the science of how climate change is fueling these stronger hurricanes. And a statistic that I particularly find compelling is that the likelihood, the probability of a hurricane of Irma's magnitude, when I was just a little girl in 1990, was 1 in 800 in any particular year, 1 in 800. And by last year, 2017, that probability had increased exponentially to 1 in 180 in any particular year. So a few degrees has a huge implication. If I think about a sector that many might not even connect with climate change, something like fisheries, and which is a major food source for islanders all around the world. Fish are cold-blooded species. Their ranges very much depend on ocean temperature. And there are some key species here in the Caribbean that if temperature were to increase by just a degree C, it entirely shifts their range where they exist. And so a few degrees makes a huge, huge difference. So thank you for raising that. In terms of your question about emergency response, we do have our own local systems. So in the Virgin Islands, it would be our Department of Disaster Management. As an overseas territory, we also get assistance from the United Kingdom. So for instance, the UK military came in within a few days of Hurricane Irma and assisted with the recovery. They've now, long since left in terms of boots being on the ground. We also are plugged into regional mechanisms. So there's the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency and a number of agencies working throughout the Caribbean that offer direct relief and support. But I think what has to be appreciated is that, these impacts don't just last the day of the event, and they don't just last until, when power is restored or when critical services are restored. At a personal level, these impacts can go for a lifetime. And when I tell you that people's lives have been fundamentally altered by this event, they have been. And then at the territory or the country level, like I said earlier in the interview, and we were just talking about this as I sat in a recovery meeting the other day, development in the Virgin Islands has been set back easily by a good 50 years. It means that we now have to go and almost entirely rebuild the country, rebuild the economy. I mean, tourism is one of our main industries here, and the economic impact to that sector alone was estimated at 2.5 times our entire GDP. So how you even begin to think about, the impact of that, the economic toll of that? We are facing a real challenge where, recovery is going to cost several $1 billion, and where do those funds come from? The countries that have created this problem are not, handing us out money to recover from this event. In fact, we're looking literally at going out on the world market and sourcing a loan, which the UK has offered to guarantee, but it's not grant funding. So it means that the Virgin Islands is going to max out its debt potential, trying to recover from this singular event. And generations, many generations down the road will be paying for this singular event. And the reality is that we could have, with climate change, we could have another Irma this year or next year, long before we're recovered. So yeah, the implications are huge, potentially crippling to small islands. And so this idea that people could become climate refugees is real. And I will confess to you that before Hurricane Irma, even as somebody who works in climate change, I didn't quite get in a very tangible way that idea that there could be people around this planet that are forced out of their countries because of climate extremes. But I fully appreciate it now, and it's not a reality that is 10, 20, 50 years down the road. It's a reality that it's already with us. There are already people having to relocate as a result of extreme climatic events linked to climate change.
So Angela, you have so many great ideas and issues to convey to us. As I say, I think we're just about at our end here. But Lance, is your question one that Angela might be able to give a brief response to?
I'll try to be very brief. Like you said, there's so much to say about this issue.
Oh no, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
I was in New Orleans after Katrina, so I know a lot of the issues that you talked about. So I expect to see trees on top of cars, but never expect to see cars on top of trees. My question is, very quickly, long before, even before Katrina, long before climate change was considered a serious problem, there was also many severe hurricanes, tornadoes, and a lot of climatic disturbances in history. So what is the direct meteorological cause and effect between climate change and these weather disturbances that would explain why it happened, why it didn't happen earlier?
Right. Well, very good question. And of course, when we talk about climate change, we're looking really at changes over a long-term average. It's sort of dangerous to sort of pick out any particular event, one that might have happened last year like Irma, or one that might have happened 50 years ago, and just try to judge based on a singular event. You really have to take the long-term averages. So one of the things in researching for the Irma diaries, one of the facts that I came across is the trend in terms of experiences with what they call major hurricanes. So that's category 3 and above hurricanes over the entire course of the Atlantic hurricane season. And we really see 1950 as a defining year, where post 1950, you see a significant increase in the number of category 3, 4, 5 storms. And so the hurricane seasons since then have the highest number of major hurricanes, as well as they've been the most active seasons overall. So if you look at the long-term trend, yes, we've had major hurricanes before that point, but we certainly see an upward trend in the number of those major events.
And isn't it, just see if the scientific piece, isn't it the ocean temperature is warmer and it causes the air, I mean, that's the
yes, I think since Irma, I've had the real privilege of getting to know Professor Kerry Emanuel. That's my connection when I talked about the work at MIT. And they have the Lorenz Center there, which is dedicated to studying the science of climate. And Professor Emanuel actually wrote the forward to the Irma diaries. And in that, he talks about these scientific links. And I think he explains it so eloquently, so simply. He says something like, hurricanes are fueled by the evaporation of seawater. And the warmer water becomes, the faster it can evaporate. And he talks about how scientists have known for a good 30 years now that as we increase atmospheric carbon dioxide, we literally increase the speed limit on hurricanes. And so the scientific links are, fairly simple and straightforward. And the data is there to show that we have been seeing, record-breaking events in terms of the strength of hurricanes and the overall activity of hurricane seasons. Like I said, the particular increase since about 1950.
Okay, Angela. You have so much to share and offer, and we're most appreciative of your taking the time. And we look forward to being in touch. We look forward to following what you do and seeing if we can support and help you in any way. And we will certainly take to heart your advice and your inspiration. You are very inspiring to us.
Thank you so much. And if I can just end by, again, thanking all of you, Elders for Climate Change, for the opportunity to be here and really share, like you said, from the front lines, which I think is a very important perspective in this global conversation. And I just want to leave people with where they can get their hands on these stories, on these accounts. So if people want to visit the website, theirmadiaries.com, they can see various options there for getting hold of the stories. And I also want to highlight the TED Talk that I did, which explores deeper this idea of bridging personal connections to climate change as a mechanism for driving urgent action. So that's available on YouTube. It's called How Hurricane Irma Can Save Our Future.